Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar on a brand new piece of research that we're about to launch in partnership with Carousell Media Group. My name is Miranda. I am the Regional CEO of IAB Southeast Asia and India. I'm also a Head of Research and have worked incredibly closely on this project. I am joined by my fellow IAB Regional Board member, and also the head of Carousell Media Group, JJ Eastwood, who was my partner in crime on the session. So just quickly about what we're going to be covering off today. About 6 months ago, we started on a project that covered the key media markets across Southeast Asia, looking into the buying behaviours of millennials, what motivates them, what do they care about. And what we're going to be doing over the next 45 minutes is taking you through some of our findings, some of the key insights that we're seeing. And we're going to kick off with there's two terms you're going to hear a lot today, and they are retail media and recommerce. So to start off, welcome JJ. I thought I'd just get straight into it. And what exactly is retail media?
Yeah, jump straight into it. Thanks, Miranda, and good afternoon, everybody. Well, look, retail media, it's nothing new. Traditionally, it's been known as connecting with shoppers close to the point of purchase, sometimes referred to as shopper marketing. But I think what's new and interesting around this space is that those traditional marketing budgets are moving online, particularly with the explosion of e-commerce. And testament to this is the advertising businesses like Amazon and Walmart. So retail media is now sort of considered advertising within a retailer's online site or app, or even within a marketplace. And usually retail media is about brands that are sold on that specific site or marketplace, but that's not always the case. So if you think about it, shoppers get hungry, and so a lot of brands that want to connect with the consumers in that way. And obviously, whenever you're shopping, you need credit cards. So financial services are super attracted towards this space as well.
So if we're looking at retail media in terms of more of an ecosystem, it seems, a lot of what I learned through the process of doing this is you sit on this wealth of first-party data. But the thing that I found probably most interesting about the Carousel platform is that not only do you have the first-party data to understand buying behaviours, you're actually sort of capturing people as they're selling and then either upgrading or buying something that they want more. So it seems that you can probably profile your users better and predict their buying behaviours. Would you say that that's a fair statement?
Yeah, I think it is a fair statement, and it's actually something we've been working on quite a lot. Is like building sort of what you're kind of referring to is audience profiles or personas, if you like. So when we delve in, we look at the audiences across the platforms, the marketplaces across the region. We find that there's these super passionate communities. So, for example, we've got in Singapore, we've got sneaker freaks. There's 500,000 people who are on our platform every month buying and selling super high-end sneakers, like in the box, not touched, and they're generally limited edition. So what we're trying to think about is like, okay, well, how do we connect brands with people that are part of these passionate communities? I actually did quite a cool campaign, I think it was last year, with Manulife, so insurance company. Insurance briefs are always challenging at the best of times. But we come up with this idea around connecting with the sneaker freak community and producing this $2,000 plus limited edition Nike Air Jordan. And it was the most successful campaign that they'd run that year. So it's being conscious about what are people passionate about and actually serving up something a bit more interesting rather than some like generic ads.
Yeah, I can definitely, so in my former life working in creative agencies, I can attest to the fact that insurance briefs tend to be the driest. I absolutely want to come back to audiences and anything that involves a niche audience or sort of that pop culture passion is fascinating. But if we dial back again, as I said, we're going to talk a lot about retail media, but we're also going to talk a lot about Recommerce. Like, is Recommerce just trying to find a fancier way of saying classifieds?
Recommerce is a whole lot more than the traditional classifieds. So you'll see a bunch of Recommerce sites that have platforms that have sprung up all over the world. So for example, the kind of additional services that a Recommerce platform would have would be warranties, guarantees. You have authentication of luxury items. So at Carousel, we do a lot of that. We partner with like Luxlate, Reebonds, Watchbox to authenticate luxury watches, and through Revo we buy back cars. So you've got that consumer to business Carousel, and then Carousel to the dealerships, so that D to B to B. But the research that we're going to dive into today, it suggests that we're at this kind of early stage of like radical transformation in e-commerce, which I think is super exciting. Again, we'll discuss this as we get into the research, but consumers are prioritizing sustainability. Interestingly, retailers, they're starting to embrace this whole resale, and policymakers are getting on board too, with the circular economy. And when you think about it, when you think about climate crisis more broadly, generally people will dive straight into talking about renewable energy. They'll talk about electric vehicles. Yet it's much, much more than that. For example, this one stat that kind of blew me away was that 10% of the world's carbon emissions come from the fashion industry. And young people are becoming much more aware of this, and they're the ones that are driving this Recommerce revolution, if you like, that's currently underway.
It's interesting that you raised that, because I was reading an article in Forbes actually on this very topic, and I'm going to read the quote so that I get it right. And it was stated that the global Recommerce market is worth $24 billion at the moment and will rise to $51 billion by 2023. So that's doubling in size. And that what is behind this is that consumers are increasingly more aware of their impact on the environment and are actively seeking out more sustainable choices in the ways that they consume. And that's sort of looking at the global perspective. But if we were to kind of bring that context down specifically into this region, how do you think we will see the impact of Recommerce and prioritizing being more, I guess, socially aware of where we buy?
Pardon me. Yeah, the stats that you mentioned make complete sense. There's lots of reports out suggesting that Recommerce is going to grow a lot faster than e-commerce over the next 5 to 10 years. But what we're seeing at the moment today, there's kind of two key trends. First of all, I touched on it before, it's this explosion of Recommerce platforms. Now, most of them are copycatting a lot of the big successful Recommerce platforms, and they're very vertical industry specific. So for example, you've got StockX and Goat in sneakers. There's a lot of players that have copied that model that have launched in this region. You've got the Real who focuses on high-end fashion. There's a number of players in this region that are doing that too. We discussed luxury watches. There's some really interesting stuff going on around cars, buying cars off consumers and selling them back to the dealerships. And then electronics is a huge one as well. There's a bunch of players we see in this region, smaller ones. A lot of them, some of them are specifically focused on mobile phones, and then some are focused on laptops and the likes. And what we're also, the second kind of main trend that we're seeing coming out is that brands, if you go back a year ago, I think brands were generally paying a lot of lip service to this and not really doing anything. But like over the last 12 months, maybe it's pandemic driven, the brands are being much more active too. So, things ranging from DBS launching a more eco-friendly credit card made out of recycled plastic. IKEA's announced a buyback program in this region. Levi's have launched their own Recommerce site and buyback program, which is all super interesting. And look, I think the other thing, I think like every industry, and this wouldn't be a presentation unless we talked about blockchain, but I did a little bit of research into this, and what I think is super interesting about the blockchain with the likes of Recommerce is using RFIDs and sensors that you can track the provenance on items. Now, what that solves is probably one of the biggest issues that's out there in the e-commerce world, and that's really easily, simply and effectively authenticating luxury items. But what will be even cooler is that you as this kind of evolves, you'll be able to track the provenance of a certain item. So you'll be able to know exactly what kind of raw materials went into something, which I think is super interesting too.
Well, this is an area that just through the process of creating this report, I discovered whole marketplaces that I never knew existed. So, for example, there are now marketplaces where influencers can sell their items that their fans have seen them wear at events once. So, of course, it's not going to landfill, but then the fan gets a piece of a celebrity that they really admire, and that there are platforms purely only for that. And I think that that's where this idea of provenance, I think, is going to become more and more important. And particularly as we've seen, like, we've gone from luxury being aspirational to there now being niche markets of luxury. So there's this subculture amongst celebrities where you don't just buy whatever Louis Vuitton's latest range is. You're going to be wearing a Louis Vuitton velour jacket from the 1980s that maybe 3 other people in the world still own. So I can see this idea of blockchain managing and kind of allowing that side of things to explode. Because you put it perfectly with like sneaker freaks. There's people who love sneakers, and then there's people who love limited edition sneakers, and then there's people who buy the limited edition sneakers that they've never worn and keep in a box in a plastic bag somewhere where the light doesn't shine on it. So it's kind of that blockchain will allow the re-commerce of items to a far broader audience.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and we've talked a bit here, and I want to dive into this more, is this idea around people being more socially conscious. I think that over the past 18 months, for many different reasons, with people are very, very aware of where their dollar goes, probably more than it has before, whether it's been through political movements such as Black Lives Matter, or whether it's through supporting your local F&B through the restrictions of the pandemic. And this idea of being socially conscious feels like it's creating this just incredibly fertile ground for re-commerce to thrive in. And do you think that this is accurate? And is this something that you're seeing across the Carousell Group platforms?
Yeah, look, we got a sense of it, but to be honest, we were blown away by the research. So the research that we conducted, 95% of under 35s felt that it was important to purchase pre-owned items because it's more sustainable. That's, I think, what we're starting to witness is like a new breed of shoppers, driven by the Gen Z millennials, and like their considerations for consuming goods has just changed, from boomers and Gen X's like you and me. You're probably the Gen X, I'm closer to boomer, but anyway. But I think what's really interesting, is that they have abandoned all these negative connotations around secondhand that the previous generations had. And certain things are very different as well. Like they're the most photographed generation. So for them, variety is key. If you're going to get your photograph taken all the time, you don't want to be wearing the same outfit. So they also pride themselves on making sure that they've got a good deal and they've paid the right price for something. And then, as you touched on, they're definitely the generation that's most aware of the impact their choices have on the environment. So I think overall, they're the generation that's making secondhand and re-commerce cool, kind of as you touched on. At Carousell, like re-commerce is definitely our top priority. Our goal is quite simply, while making it kinder to the planet, we want to make it easy and fun. And there's some big problems to solve today that we need to get over in order for this to really take off. Authentication, we discussed a few times, but also things like shipping bulky items like furniture, and overall kind of making re-commerce and secondhand more trusted and convenient. That those things are super important to solve for. some of the things that we're working on, like at the moment, in fashion, we'll be creating catalogs around the hottest trends and brands. Electronics, we've already introduced like a 12-month warranty for post-purchase, and then I touched on like an electronic or luxury. At the moment, we're partnering with people to help us authenticate those high-value items.
But we saw that Amazon recently announced that they're launching like a luxury shop, or a luxury storefront that allows brands to connect directly with consumers. Are we kind of just seeing a bit of a fad when it comes to the luxury segment?
I think what Amazon are trying to do is very different. That they actually want to emulate Tmall. They want the high-end brands to sell through Amazon, sell their brand new items. It's very different to the Recommerce model. I think the global leader in Recommerce for high-end luxury is the Real. So it's quite interesting if you watch them and how they've evolved over the years, in terms of brands saying, hey, we don't want to be involved. This is a kind of second-hand market that we can't control, to really embracing it. You've got people like Stella McCartney who's coming out saying, yep, this makes complete sense. There's $5 billion of wastage every year in the fashion industry. We need to take control of this. And I also think, which is quite interesting, is that brands are starting to realize, actually, this is a really big opportunity for us. It's a gateway for younger audiences to get into our brand. That they probably wouldn't be able to afford the brand new item, but you get them in at an early age and they're buying the second-hand items, and they become affiliated with that brand, and you've got a consumer for life, perhaps. I think that's super interesting too.
Yeah, definitely, and it's the thing you brought up Stella McCartney, because I think she's kind of always been a bit more of a pioneer in this space. Like, she was one of the first luxury designers to commit to only vegan products. And so there definitely seems to be an alignment, perhaps, where these brands that would have kind of been doing, I suppose, what you could say is the right thing for a while, to really be able to champion it at a larger scale.
Yeah, she's pretty cool, and it's quite cool having your dad being one of the Beatles as well.
I think that's probably a whole nother webinar. But I think we kind of have to bring this back to business at some point. And so when we look at Recommerce, I can certainly see that it takes two major buying motivations, and this is what the research told us loud and clear. And what the research does tell us loud and clear is that no matter how much you care about the ocean, that the priorities are always the ability to get a great deal, and that is then supported by the ability to get a great deal, but also be sustainable, to also be able to feed your own need to be socially conscious. And so if we talk about these two key areas and where they intersect, like, what does this mean for retail media in terms of like brand advertising opportunities?
Yeah, well, the major appeal around retail media always is connecting with consumers while they're actively shopping. With digital, it's so much more powerful because you've got their intent, exactly what their search queries are, and then you can couple that with their browsing behavior. However, I think Recommerce, it adds this whole additional new kind of dimension, and savvy brands are starting to capitalize on the selling signals that you get from Recommerce too. So, not just what people are buying, but what they're selling. To give you a good example of that, I've got the relatively recent model of the iPhone. If I list this a month prior to the new release, there's a high probability that I'm doing so to upgrade. It's a perfect opportunity for brands to target me whenever I've got a really high purchase intent signal through what I'm selling. And there's a whole range of things like this. So we have discovered, for example, we can understand where parents are at by what they're buying and selling. You know that they're recently pregnant with the books that they buy and the furniture they buy, or they've now got toddlers because of, again, the things that they're buying, and or perhaps selling or getting rid of the cot.
Yeah.
You know that their children are starting to. So it's adding all of these signals together and you come up with a really sophisticated understanding of consumers. Presents a ton of opportunities for brand advertisers.
So with all of these opportunities, like if we were to look into a crystal ball, do you think that this will kind of almost force the hand of brands to be more socially conscious, as it's just going to be a non-negotiable for customers?
Well, I think it kind of depends on what's meant by becoming more socially responsible. So if you mean like being more active in Recommerce, brands like Lululemon and Levi's and IKEA, they've all recently announced these buyback programs and reducing wastage. I think even take a look at Apple, one of the most prestigious brands in the world. Like they sell refurbished items. If that's kind of what you're referring to, then yes, and this research backs that up. However, if you're referring to brands perhaps launching like a new eco range that's going to be more expensive because it's made from renewable fabrics, then this research doesn't really back that up. You see, what came out really loud and clear is that in addition to being more sustainable, shoppers really want a good deal, which we discussed. So it's a combination of those two things, which I think is really behind Recommerce and is above and beyond just sustainability in and on itself.
Mm. With a lot of what we looked at, we split the research into just the two age groups, under 35s and over 35s. And like the brief to us was to look specifically kind of at these two segments, and because there was you were aware that you're very, very carousel platforms are very strong in the under 35 market. Has this kind of more millennial audience always been your strongest supporters and like your strongest users?
Yeah, it has. So if you think back to whenever Lucas, Marcus, C-Ray, they created Carousel in 2012, they were fresh out of uni. So their first customers were naturally uni students and grads, and that's who they targeted. But what's super cool is that those same people have kind of grown up with the platform over the last 9 years. So they're now young parents and they're buying things like property and cars. But I think what's been really encouraging to see is that, particularly over the last couple of years with the pandemic, is that the Gen Z, the much younger generation, particularly students, they are turning to the platform not just to shop, but also to try and make some money themselves. And they're launching their own business ventures on Carousel, which I think is super cool too.
So I've used Carousel, not just because I know you, but I've used Carousel a lot over the past few years. And I've used it both to sell my own items as I moved apartments, but I've also bought a lot. And when you talk about the side income, I was quite surprised at the number of almost like independent storefronts that operate within the Carousel environment. So you can it's almost like being able to become your own retail entrepreneur.
Yeah, it's definitely the easiest way to launch your own business. You can list for free up to 30 items, and as your business evolves, there's a bunch of tools for small businesses to use as well. Which and the amount of stories we have of that is really great.
Yeah, and with it's like we touch back on these research results, and I promise you all that you will see the full regional summary be published on Monday. But we're kind of giving you like that top level recap. And so Carousel platforms that we're talking about, we looked at Carousel in Singapore, Philippines, Hong Kong. We looked at in Malaysia, we looked at both Carousel and the local market platform, which is Mudah.my. And then in Vietnam, we looked at Cho Tot.
Yeah.
And this is that's quite a broad range of different sites. But the thing that we saw absolutely loud and clear is that the local options and the regional options eclipsed the Western alternatives. This includes Amazon, it included ASOS. So, kind of, I think beyond just, language, why do you think we are seeing newer and younger sites taking over?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what I mentioned, a few moments ago, is that, if you look deeply at the consumers on Carousel, Mudah, Cho Tot, they're much more than just consumers. They're buyers and sellers, and they've grown up with the marketplace from a very early age. And quite often they're part of some kind of passionate community on the platform. We mentioned Sneaker Freaks, but there's a ton of others. Actually, a really great example is the luxury watch community in Carousel in Singapore. So we've got a really big marketplace experience team, over 100 people, and we use AI to kind of weed out and monitor fraudulent items. We obviously take that very seriously. But if you list a fake watch, never mind the AI and the big team and everything else, our community will sniff you out in a heartbeat and call you out on it as well. Just because they're so passionate, it's like, how dare you pollute our community with this, nonsense? And that spans right across the board, which I think is really great. So I think it's being part of that community, I think, is really what sort of sets our platforms apart from the Western brands. And, our founders are super conscious of this. They genuinely deeply care about those communities, and they're top of mind in pretty much everything we do. And I think that's very different from most of the Western brands that you're kind of referring to.
So you touched on like luxury watches as one of these kind of communities that we're seeing a lot of movement in. And the one thing that I wasn't really expecting, and this is of course my own inherent bias, was of the overall user profiles. We saw a hugely wide range of incomes, but what we did see was that a fairly high level of the audience were at the higher end of household incomes. And is there a reason for this?
Well, so we weren't super surprised. There's a couple of bits that we're surprised about, and bits that weren't sort of surprising. So overall, the high income levels, we knew were there. Like, we see $50,000 watches selling on our marketplaces like regularly, weekly, particularly in Singapore and Hong Kong. And I think that's just indicative of savvy shoppers. But, what I thought was really interesting, I couldn't believe it actually, the 1 in 3 of the under 35s in Singapore bought a Rolex in the last 12 months. Which is, first of all, how do you even get a hold of a Rolex? There's such a waiting list. I guess you can buy and sell them on Carousel. But that was a really interesting stat that jumped out at us. And then what's kind of a bit of a paradox to this is that if you look at those same under 35 group, 1 in 3 also said that savings took up the highest percentage of their income. So this clearly indicates that they're very savvy shoppers, and that they're willing to save for those, real high-end items that they want.
Yeah. I'm just going to jump out. We have a question from our audience, and I want to make sure that this session is as interactive as possible. And that a question is, do you find that brands are nervous to go into the secondhand space?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think that if you were to ask me that 12 months ago, I would say absolutely yes. But I think now, with so many big global brands taking the lead, I mentioned some of the brands there, like Lululemon, Levi's, IKEA, Apple. We're talking to a bunch of other brands who are like, how do we take control of this ourselves? There is, I wouldn't say nervousness, but there is an understanding from the brands that they need to decouple their Recommerce efforts from their natural storefronts. And that's what those brands I mentioned have all done. So, Levi's have a specific store for Recommerce, and so do Lululemon. So I think what they're trying to figure out is, do they do it themselves, or do they partner with a vertical player? Is it a ThredUp or the likes of or whoever the vertical that they operate in? I think it's more the logistics that they're probably more nervous about than anything else.
So the way that this is kind of being framed is that you should only kind of look at Recommerce if you're sort of selling secondhand items yourself. But I don't think that that's quite the case, because not everything that we're seeing on the Carousel platforms is secondhand. There is a huge brand new items market, and that G2C.
Yeah, half of what's sold on Carousel is brand new. Yeah. Over 50% of items are brand new items.
Yeah. So going back to the two categories that we've mentioned a lot, we specifically focused on two verticals, which was the luxury and electronics. And when you sort of reached out to partner with us in this research, what made you want to look at those two specifically?
Well, if you look across the region, I'll take them individually, but electronics is one of our biggest categories. So if you think about a traditional classified site, it's generally, autos, property, services, jobs perhaps. But, across our platforms, electronics is definitely one of the biggest categories. And the research backs this up. So 75% of respondents said that they bought at least one electronic item in the last 12 months. And then if we look a little bit deeper into electronics, and this isn't really much of a surprise, like the top subcategories were all of those that kind of facilitate, home entertainment, working from home, cooking from home, obviously people spending more time at home due to the pandemic. So things like gaming, computers, home appliances were obviously very important and what people are buying a lot of. But what I thought what was really interesting about this research is that there almost then became an overlap between electronics and luxury. And we didn't really realize this going into this, because in markets like the Philippines and Vietnam, an iPhone, for example, is considered a luxury item. And luxury has been like a real focus in the likes of Singapore and Hong Kong. And the research that we did, it really kind of backs this up. So I think, if off the top of my head, so Vietnam, we saw 72% of respondents, they had bought a luxury product in the last 12 months. This is significantly higher across the region. And demand for electronics, it was already growing sort of pre-pandemic, but obviously that really kind of accelerated the growth.
Yeah, and going back to this, what luxury means as a term, we very clearly had categories. So, for example, bags and wallets, luggage. But we included another option in the responses, and I certainly could never have predicted what would be submitted under other. People considered, as you mentioned, iPhones as a luxury item. We also saw people who bought gold, people who bought property. And it's kind of that this luxury is no longer just kind of like a very clear, defined category. That luxury is almost in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
And so I think tying this all back to business and why people have tuned in is, if we look at the Carousel platforms and Carousell Media Group, is like, what sort of briefs would you say that the Carousel platforms across the region are perfect for?
Well, if we just go off the campaigns that have been most successful, and this is obviously quite intuitive, and it's really brands that are organically searched for and bought and sold on Carousel. So I'd named some of those brands earlier, but you know, if there's millions and millions of dollars of your brand being bought and sold on our platforms, and tapping into that organic search is, you know, super powerful. You know, if we've got someone who's buying and selling a bunch of different Apple products, we know that they're an Apple advocate. You know, and then brands are also, as we mentioned before, that are kind of open to new ideas and ways in which they can connect with people. I mentioned the Manulife example, you know, putting up that prize around sneakers. And then lastly, again, we discussed this before, but shoppers get hungry. I have to say this, but you know, the likes, if we put an offer up there for McDonald's or KFC or Pizza Hut, they always do really well.
Interesting. So I just want to open this up for questions as we are heading into the last sort of few minutes of the webinar. So we've got a couple more. I think some that we've already covered, but yeah, here's a good one. Because the way that we conducted this research was we conducted it in the local markets that I mentioned, in the local language. And then we summarise that into the report that we'll be sharing on Monday. But for the local reports, were there some sort of key points from different markets that really stuck out to you personally?
Trying to think of things that we didn't already cover. The things that jumped to mind, you know, in Singapore was the 1 in 3 under 35s ban of Rolex in the last year. That just blows my mind.
Wasn't that just jealousy?
Yeah, it's very much jealousy, and it's taken me 43 years, and I still haven't got my Rolex. So that definitely jumps to mind. But then I think the other one was actually in Vietnam, so it was the other way around. It was over to the 35s, and it was 1 in 4 had bought a Rolex. So I think, I don't know what happened to this pandemic, but it seems to have been super helpful for Rolex. And then, you know, we also touched on this before, but, you know, we do need to be more conscious of what we mean when we are talking about luxury, because as you mentioned, it's very different in different markets. And, you know, an iPhone is a $1,000 iPhone is certainly a luxurious item in certain markets.
Yeah, when it came to what stuck out to me, mine was definitely around the property ownership and the fact that Singapore, with its government support through both CPF and, you know, being able to purchase subsidised housing. I mean, Singapore property ownership was, I believe, off the top of my head, around 71% for people over 35. And I just thought that, and when you saw it in comparison to the other markets, you realised what a really incredible scheme that is for Singapore citizens. And then another one that did stick out to me, and no hate, this is what the numbers said, was that our respondents from Hong Kong just really didn't care that much about sustainability. So
not as much. Yeah. Still around 45%. But you compare that to you know, the rest of the region. Yeah, there's a big discrepancy. You still have almost half the audience who did care about it. But yeah, I did think it was very interesting that there was a big difference between the Hong Kong market and the rest of the region when it did come to the attitudes around sustainability.
Look, I also remember that Hong Kong, because property prices are just so expensive, that there was a lower rate of home ownership. So maybe we need to do a further study on, is there a tie between owning a property and sort of caring about sustainability?
Could be an interesting line to follow.
But there was definitely some interesting behaviours around savings, and that was certainly another area that I wasn't expecting to be so strong, and that is people prioritising savings. People, when they're purchasing items that they really want, they either pay for it from savings, save for it, pay for it from savings, or wait for that item to go on sale. And I know you mentioned Singapore specifically, like saving, I think, was around 20% of their income. But how did you see this translate across the other local markets?
Yeah, that was something that I was also surprised and again jealous about as well. I wish I was saving 20 plus percent of my my salary every month, like these young people are. And you know, again, it's all kind of tied together, because you know this whole sense around of savings, I think, um, is also linked with reducing waste, and not just consuming all of the time, selling things perhaps before you buy. And it does come down to the fact that you're living in, if you're living at home and you've got limited space, then you don't want so much clutter, in addition to being able to save. So it's quite interesting. It's all kind of interlinked.
Mm. And do you think that even though we're seeing, all signs are pointing to an economic slowdown, that these savings and sort of being savvier shoppers is how we're looking at probably this more aspirational consumer class that came out kind of loud and clear amongst our audience profiling?
Yeah, and we bring it back to the fact that we discussed this before, the most photographed generation. And if you are posting things online a lot, you want a diverse look. And I remember, gosh, don't show my age, I used to work in magazines 100 years ago, and the girls that worked at Vogue, they used to have to buy and sell things on eBay all of the time because they had to have the latest handbag, and they had to have the latest high heels. I think I remember they were the two key things that they had to have. But so what they would do is they would save up, they would buy the latest handbags, they would have connections at the high-end stores to make sure it's the absolute latest. They would wear it around for a month or two, keep it in absolute pristine condition. Like I remember looking underneath their high heels where they had they cut out stickers so that they wouldn't get them scuffed up, and then they would sell them on eBay. So every time they're upgrading to the new handbag, so it's an initial investment up front, but every time they're upgrading to the new handbag or the new high heels, how much they have to put forward is a small fraction of the actual price because they're selling before they buy. And I think a lot of this research is indicative of that's what's happening here too.
Yeah. And look, we have 2 minutes left. And it's actually a bit of a cracker of a question, is what exactly do we mean by sustainability? Like, is it only secondhand?
No, that's a great question, and there's so much to that. So, as I mentioned before, it can range from the likes of banks getting involved, where they want to reduce overall emissions by reducing their electricity that they use, producing credit cards that are made out of recyclable materials. I think it's overall being more environmentally conscious.
And what a beautiful note to end on. I'd like to thank everybody for spending the last 45 minutes with us. I would like to thank JJ for being my co-host of this session. I would also like to say a special thanks to the people behind the scenes who made all of this happen. We worked very closely with Mahira and Jolyn from Carousell, and also Laura from the IAB team. There is an army of people who come together to publish anything that is at this level of depth. You will all receive a follow-up from this, as we have all of your details from registration, and that will include a link to download the report on Monday. If you have any questions at all, please reach out to myself in regards to the research. Please reach out to JJ in regards to talking about retail media and how you can work with Carousell Media Group. But everyone, please have a lovely rest of your Thursday.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.